Honesty. In the words of the Billy Joel song, honesty is hardly ever heard, and it can feel like everyone is untrue. And as the song continues, it is mostly what we need from each other. Honesty. Now, we've talked about honesty a few times over the last few weeks. Honesty with others and with ourselves, and how we honestly fit into the world around us, and how we can honestly misperceive things around us, like when we experience imposter syndrome. And as Billy Joel reminds us, honesty is something that we really do need from each other. Now, there are genuinely dishonest people in this world, people who actively lie and manipulate and take advantage of others. Now, I don't believe that any of you watching fall into that category, but I do believe that you're probably not being fully honest with the people in your life. Let me rephrase that. You're likely not being vulnerable. Most of us aren't. Now, not long ago, my friend EZ visited us here at the Voice of Prophecy to do some voice acting for Discovery Mountain. That's our program for kids and families. Now, EZ brought his friend Liz with him, and as we talked, he gushed, telling me what he likes most about Liz. You see, EZ was born blind, and for most of his life, the people around him have doted on him. He was a cute kid, and he was musical. And so from an early age, he stole the spotlight with his singing and his winsome personality. Until Liz came into his life, EZ wasn't used to anyone pushing back on his ideas or telling him anything except what they thought that he wanted to hear. EZ grinned from ear to ear as he told me about how Liz argues with him and tells him when he's being a nerd. Honesty, that's what Liz gives to EZ, and he adores her for it. Now, being honest and vulnerable with others, it isn't easy for most of us. We've all built up walls and protective mechanisms in our lives. These protective mechanisms can begin early in life and innocently. We've all had the experience of sharing something that we're interested in, let's say like rock collecting, and the other person just doesn't get it. They might shrug or worse, laugh at our interest. And so instinctively, we file that experience in our minds for later. If you talk about rock collecting, other people won't get it, we tell ourselves. It's easy to then make the next couple of mental leaps. If they don't get rock collecting, they don't get me. And if one person laughed at me about rock collecting, everyone else will too. Protective walls go up instinctively, innocently. It happens to all of us. We put layers of protective armor on and around ourselves. Now, these protective walls can impact our relationships. Let's go back to EZ and Liz. If the first time that Liz had questioned EZ about something, if he had responded with anger instead of with a grin, Liz might have stopped being honest with him. EZ's response to her let her know that she didn't have to put up a protective wall in that area. She could be honest. Now, vulnerability means stepping around the protective walls that we build and letting ourselves be honest and open with others, letting our weaknesses, our oddities show, and talking honestly with others about the things that we see in their lives. But stepping past those protective walls can be terrifying. Being vulnerable opens us up to potential ridicule, hurt, and pain. But being vulnerable allows us to grow in our relationships with each other, with ourselves, and with God. You know, the popular writer and speaker, Brené Brown, she writes about vulnerability in leadership in our homes, our workplaces, and in our faith communities. Brown shatters the myth that vulnerability equals weakness. Being vulnerable, it's not easy, but leaders push through the discomfort, Brown writes, and, quote, the fear of vulnerability and all that comes with taking off the armor, the fear of being judged or misunderstood, of making a mistake, being wrong, and experiencing shame is universal, end quote. Universal. We all experience shame and the fear of being misunderstood or judged, and we instinctively resist being vulnerable. And so, why not stay safely tucked behind our protective walls or armor? Well, the Bible has good counsel for us on just how vulnerability grows our spiritual relationships with each other. Let's read about it in the book of James. James chapter 5 and verse 16. Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. When we confess our trespasses, our faults to each other, we're being vulnerable. And there's nothing quite like admitting to our own faults and mistakes to make us feel open to judgment and ridicule. But in the context of our spiritual walk with others, there's an obligation on the part of the other believer. The verse encourages us to be vulnerable with each other, to let down the protective wall and admit when we've done things wrong. And it continues. Next, we should pray for one another that we may be healed. So there's a right way to accept another's vulnerability, and that's to join with them on that next step, which is healing. There's power in the effective, fervent prayer of honest believers. You know, we see in this verse a roadmap for honesty. It begins with one person's willingness to set down the armor and talk about difficult things. But it doesn't end there. The next step is healing. Through prayer, the individuals include someone higher than either of them into their relationship. Prayer, you see, brings God into the relationship. And so, are you being honest with the people in your life? Are you willing to be vulnerable? And are you willing to take the next step toward healing? If you are, I invite you not to miss the most important part of this venture in honesty. Invite God into the process. Your fervent prayers are powerful. They will make the discomfort and the fear of vulnerability worthwhile and meaningful.